When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8 years old. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning. So around 2 a.m. we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour and still had few more to drive. And I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me because I didn't have the sleep to really fall asleep in a car yet. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, the car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car and shrugged off my mother's tension. A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city. And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a very eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper aware of the car and entertained ourselves by watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, the car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight, it was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, didn't stop, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more. Like he knew he was freaking us out and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over! Right in front of the police! Pull over right now, Miguel!" And he did. And the car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked us what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us, and taunted us. The policeman took our claims very seriously and told us how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. And then he offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later, when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. 10 minutes later, we saw the car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting. When my daughter was 2, I was having a tough time as a single mother and decided to take a road trip up Highway 1. I made reservations in Trinidad at a cool cabin in the woods within walking distance of the beach. Before I left, my stepfather gave me a loaded .38 revolver, which I stored under the driver's seat. Sometime after driving through San Francisco, it was very late and dark and nobody was on the highway. My daughter was sleeping peacefully in her car seat next to me. Back then, we could legally have car seats in the front. I noticed a car coming up behind me and passed, but then slowed down, driving alongside me. I sped up and slowed down, but could not shake him. I looked over and this guy had his interior lights on and was furiously gesturing for me to pull over. I knew I had to find a safe place. There was nobody else on the road, and I was running low on gas. There was just nothing on this highway for miles. I kept driving, but this guy would not leave me alone. I was getting very frightened, but the mama bear was coming out, and I was getting very angry as well. I knew he could see my kid, who was still sleeping. Finally, there was an exit up ahead and a gas station in the middle of nowhere, so I took the exit with the guy closely following me. I wasn't sure what to do. The gas station was brightly lit, but had no customers. I didn't feel that it was safe to pull in yet. So I slowly passed it and drove further into the dark, deserted landscape and pulled into a large dirt area and drove quite a ways off the highway, with him following me, and there being absolutely nothing around. I knew I was in big trouble, and I needed to take control and wanted to put him in a vulnerable situation. Mama Bear was in full protective mode, and I was pissed. I stopped the car, grabbed the gun, and jumped out, locking the car behind me. As he pulled up, I ran around to the passenger side and waited. He then got out of his car and quickly moved towards me, and I suddenly held the gun up, visible in the moonlight. He came to a halt, surprised, and I then leveled the gun across the car, taking aim, and waited. He stood there, weighing his options, and then turned around, got back into his car, and left. Not a word was spoken. Totally freaked me out. I'm from Connecticut. I was in a long-distance relationship with a girl from Georgia and would often make road trips down to visit her. I don't really mind. I love road trips. I've driven across the United States and back, all on my own. There's just something about traveling the highways of the US by yourself that's just so freeing. To save money, I would sleep in my car. It's not so bad. It's basically camping in a metal tent. Makes you feel like you're really roughing it. I just recline the seat back, keep the key in the ignition just in case, and doze off. And no, I don't put anything up to block the windows for privacy. Maybe I should have. The trip down south is a comfortable 2-day drive. My stop would usually be somewhere along the Virginia-North Carolina border. So for my previous trip, that's exactly where I stopped that night. Rest stops were often less trafficked and thus quieter than truck stops. Normally I would have stopped at a Love's, but I was so tired that I settled for the first rest stop I saw. It was oddly vacant that night, with only a couple lone cars sitting under the amber streetlights. Most likely travelers with the same idea as myself. I pulled into a parking spot away from the others, under the shadow of a tree and far from the street lamps. I figured I would have more privacy there, as opposed to being bathed in light. So I did my usual thing, locked my doors, opened the window just a hair for ventilation, kept my key in, reclined the seat, and went to sleep. I was never interrupted on any of these car camping nights, so I never suspected anything on this one. Then a sharp tap woke me up. At first I thought I had heard it in my dream. I then opened my eyes, a bit confused. Since I leaned back, I was facing the ceiling and couldn't see anything. I heard another tap, like a tiny object hitting a hard surface. It came in an irregular rhythm. Was it raining? Was water dripping onto my windshield? I'm under a tree. Maybe something fell from the branches. Maybe a squirrel or a bird dropped something. What if a squirrel was climbing around my car? Or what if it wasn't an animal? The thought occurred to me that it might very well be a person poking around. What did they want? Were the doors locked? Yes, the keys were in the ignition. I can leave in an instant. Still, I lay there, completely still, pretending to be asleep, pretending I hadn't heard anything, hoping whoever it was, they would leave me alone. It was better to not find out. I was too afraid to find out. It was better to stay here in blissful ignorance. Still, the tapping continued. I had to do something. There was no way I was just going to stay there. I had to look. My heart was pounding, and at that moment, it was deafeningly loud. Whoever was outside could probably hear it too. I decided I was going to look. I was going to raise my head up and see what was making the noise. So that's what I did. What met my eyes sent a jolt through my entire body. Every muscle fiber locked up in pure shock at what I saw. The faint glow of the street lamps cast just enough light for me to make out what I was looking at. There, in the windshield, staring directly at me, was a face. Someone I presumed to be a woman was lying on my hood, her face pressed right up against my windshield. Her face was completely still, locked in a permanent grin. I froze in overwhelming terror. The eyes I stared into appeared to have rolled back, showing only the whites. The nose was turned up, pressed painfully into the glass. The lips stretched wide, revealing horrid, rotten teeth. Even in the darkness, I could tell her skin was sickly pale, contrasting her long, filthy black hair. Whoever this was, she was clearly not in her right mind. I don't know how long I sat there, too afraid to move. Finally, I got a grip on myself and shot my hand to the ignition. It turned over, making in that instant the most beautiful sound I heard. For a split second, I was afraid I might be caught in a horror movie scenario, the one where the car won't crank as the killer approaches. I reversed as fast as I could, trying not to give this creeper time to try anything. In my panic, I remember activating the windshield wipers in a futile attempt to get her off. I thought, was I about to drive out of here with some wacko holding onto my hood? Thankfully, I didn't have to worry about that, because as soon as I stopped, the woman leapt off, landing on all fours. Seeing my opportunity, I shifted into drive and gunned it, right as I saw her reaching for the driver's side door. With my foot on the gas, I sped out of the parking lot. And behind me, I heard her letting out a piercing shriek like that of an animal. I looked in my rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw her chasing me on all fours, her black hair swinging wildly around her. I couldn't get a good look as I rounded a curve in the road leading out of the rest stop and merging with the highway. There, I picked up speed and drove through the night. I did not dare stop until I saw the morning light.